I can still feel the cold shimmer of the champagne glass in my hand, the room glowing with soft golden lights as applause echoed around me. And then, like a blade cutting through silk, the sound of a body hitting the floor. My daughter-in-law's dress fanned out across the hardwood as she collapsed, and in that split second, the truth slammed into me harder than the shock itself. That drink had never been meant for her. If you've ever trusted someone who stood close enough to hurt you, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. These moments change us in ways we never forget. As the chaos swarmed around her, I felt a calm, icy clarity settle over me, a feeling I still struggle to explain. That was the moment everything started to unravel. She went down before anyone understood what was happening. One moment, Megan was lifting her glass in that crowded banquet hall, and the next she was crumpled on the floor, the room snapping from laughter to panic in a single breath. I remember the sharp clatter of her glass spinning across the tile, the way the lights above suddenly felt too bright, and the cold certainty that slid through me as I watched people rush toward her. At 70, I have lived long enough to recognize the truth the moment it stares me in the face. That collapse was never meant for her. It was meant for me. I stood there with a kind of stunned stillness, feeling the edges of betrayal press into my ribs like something physical. I had raised a family, weathered losses, and built a quiet, steady life, never imagining that danger could find me in a room full of people offering congratulations. Yet as the noise swelled around Megan, a strange calm settled over me. I had switched the glasses. I knew exactly what she had just swallowed. Even now, the memory carries a metallic taste, as if the air itself had turned sharp. I kept my face composed while my mind raced ahead, already tracing back through the small signs I had ignored. That was the night everything snapped into focus. But to understand why I moved the way I did, you need to see what led up to that moment. So let me take you back to earlier that day. Earlier that morning, before the lights, the music, and the sudden collapse. I woke with a sense of quiet accomplishment. The retirement celebration had been planned for months, and I wanted the day to honor the years I had poured into the company I built after losing my husband. That business had carried me through grief, through loneliness, and into a life where stability felt earned, not given. I thought the party would be a gentle closing chapter. I was wrong. When I arrived at the venue, the room felt warm, full of familiar faces and soft laughter. People kept touching my arm, telling me I deserved this moment. I let myself believe them, even as a faint uneasiness tugged at me. It was subtle, like a draft slipping through a closed window. My son, Daniel, arrived with Megan not long after. I remember watching them cross the room. Daniel looked distracted, almost distant, while Megan carried that bright smile she often used when she wanted something. I tried to shake off the feeling, reminding myself it was simply a big day, a transitional one. Still, a small part of me noticed the way Megan hovered near me, the way her eyes tracked my glass more than my face. Throughout the afternoon, I kept catching moments that felt just slightly off. A whisper cut short when I approached, a glance exchanged across the table, a tightening in my chest I couldn't explain. I brushed it all aside, determined to enjoy the celebration. But looking back, I can see it clearly now. The danger didn't start with a glass hitting the floor. It started hours earlier, with instincts I chose not to trust. And those instincts were about to be tested in ways I never imagined. Everything that happened next felt slow and sharp, as if the air itself thickened around me. When the server approached with the champagne, I reached for my glass with a steady hand, but inside I felt that same uneasy pull that had followed me all afternoon. I had watched Megan glance toward the tray earlier, a brief, calculating flick of her eyes that I tried to dismiss. Yet when the fresh glasses were placed before us, something in me refused to ignore the warning any longer. I studied the two flutes for only a heartbeat, but it was enough. The faint smudge on the rim, the way Megan hovered just close enough to track my movements, those tiny details locked together in my mind. Without a word, without even changing my expression, I shifted the glasses as if making room on the table. It was a small motion, almost invisible, yet it felt like crossing a threshold I could never return from. Megan lifted the glass I had set near her. I felt a cold wave move through my chest as she drank, completely unaware. For a moment, nothing happened, and I wondered if I had imagined everything. Then her knees buckled, and the room fractured into chaos. People rushed toward her, voices rising, chairs scraping. I stayed still, watching the panic bloom around us. Daniel looked shaken, but behind his confusion I sensed something deeper, fear that the plan had gone wrong. As I stood there, the truth settled over me with crushing certainty. My suspicions were no longer shadows. They were real, and they had a trajectory. Whatever had been set into motion was only beginning, and I knew the next steps would unfold beyond that frantic room. I felt the horizon of my life shift into unfamiliar, threatening shapes. The ride to the hospital felt strangely quiet, even with the sirens scattering the night. I sat in the back of the ambulance beside Megan, watching the pale stillness settle over her face. My hands were steady, but inside, something trembled. The chaos from the party still rang faintly in my ears, yet beneath it all, a sharper understanding had begun to form. I kept replaying the moment the glasses touched, the subtle shift I made, the way her eyes had followed my movements earlier. None of it felt accidental anymore. When we arrived, the harsh fluorescent lights washed everything in an unsettling glow. Nurses hurried Megan through double doors, and I stood alone for a moment, letting the sterile smell pull me into a strange calm. Eventually, staff murmured things around me, fragments about toxins, irregular reactions, and timing. They didn't realize I was listening as closely as I was. Their words didn't confirm anything outright, but they aligned too neatly with what I already feared. Daniel paced the waiting area, restless and pale. He kept glancing toward me, then away again, as if afraid of what he might find in my expression. I watched him, noticing the tightness in his shoulders, the way guilt flickered through his eyes before he forced it down. I had raised that man. I knew every version of his face, and this one told me far too much. As I sat there, the truth became quiet and undeniable. This wasn't a single impulsive act. This was part of a plan, one that had been building behind my back, threaded through moments I had dismissed as ordinary. The realization settled heavily in my chest, not as panic, but as purpose. Whatever I faced next, it was time to protect myself. The morning after the hospital ordeal felt strangely hollow, as if the walls of my home were listening for what would come next. I moved slowly through my kitchen, still absorbing the weight of the previous night, when I heard Daniel at my door. He rarely arrived that early, and the look on his face carried a softness that felt practiced. As he stepped inside, I sensed a careful performance unfolding, concern wrapped so tightly around intention that most people might have mistaken it for love. He spoke in gentle tones, circling around the idea that I shouldn't be living alone anymore, that my age made me vulnerable, that what happened at the party proved how much I needed oversight. While he talked, I watched his eyes more than his gestures. They held none of the warmth I remembered from his childhood. Instead, I saw calculation, The same flicker I'd noticed at the hospital when he realized the danger had turned back onto them. A part of me grieved in real time, remembering the boy who used to cling to my hand at the grocery store, who once cried when he thought he'd lost sight of me. Now he stood in my kitchen, speaking gently while nudging me toward surrender. After he left, Megan called. Her voice carried the same script, sympathy layered over subtle pressure, hints about my well-being, suggestions that decisions needed to be made soon. The coordination between them was undeniable, and hearing it laid bare through her tone made something inside me go still. By noon, clarity had hardened into truth. They weren't trying to protect me. They were trying to contain me, direct me, possibly remove me. The sorrow of that realization settled deep, but beneath it, a different force stirred, resolve. It was time to defend myself. By the time the sun began to slip across my living room floor, I knew I couldn't waste another hour. The heaviness from the morning lingered, but beneath it ran a sharper current, an instinct telling me that hesitation could cost me more than peace. So I drove to the one person who had seen me through the hardest chapters of my life, Michael, my attorney of nearly 20 years. He had guided me after my husband died, helped me build my company, and understood the quiet strength I relied on. Walking into his office felt like stepping into a refuge, though even there, unease followed me. As I sat across from him, I laid out everything. Megan's collapse, the switched glasses, the strange pressure from Daniel, the coldness in his eyes. Speaking it aloud made the truth feel heavier, and I watched concern settle across Michael's face. His silence told me more than words ever could. When he finally shared his thoughts, the weight of the situation deepened. He reminded me that proving intent is far more complex than proving harm, and that without concrete evidence, suspicion alone wouldn't protect me. Then came the second blow. He warned me about competency challenges, how easily someone my age could be painted as confused or unstable if they wanted control. Hearing that felt like a door shutting somewhere behind me. I had always believed my independence was unquestionable, but now I saw how fragile it appeared on paper. We reviewed documents, tightened structures, initiated evaluations, and drafted protections I never imagined needing. Each step felt both empowering and devastating. When I finally stepped back into the cool afternoon air, the truth was undeniable. This wasn't about misunderstandings or wounded feelings. This was survival. And I would have to think several steps ahead if I wanted to stay safe. When I walked back into my house, the air felt different, still familiar, but edged with something sharper. The fear that had shadowed me all morning shifted into a steadier determination. I wasn't going to wait for danger to find me again. Within an hour, I had a security company at my door. I watched them move through each room, installing cameras, reinforcing entry points, sealing the quiet vulnerabilities I had never bothered to see before. My home slowly transformed into something sturdier, safer, though the sight of it left a bittersweet ache in my chest. I never imagined needing this kind of protection from my own family. When the technicians finished, I sat at my dining table with the stack of revised documents Michael sent over, my updated will, new trusts, medical directives. Every page was a reminder of the reality I now lived in. My hands were steady as I initialed and signed, but my heart tightened when I reached the inheritance section. I reduced Daniel's share and removed Megan entirely. It felt brutal, yet necessary, a decision made not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I had spent decades building a life worth something. I would not let anyone steer it toward harm. As I reviewed the final notarized copies, a heavy quiet settled around me. It wasn't grief exactly, but the hollow understanding that love alone could no longer guide my choices. I placed the documents in my safe just as a knock echoed from the front door, unexpected, tentative. And when I opened it, I found Megan's mother standing there, her eyes carrying a story of their own. The knock at the door lingered in the air, soft but insistent, and for a moment I simply stood there, feeling the weight of yesterday settle across my shoulders. When I finally opened it, I found Megan's mother on my porch. She looked smaller than I remembered, her eyes clouded with exhaustion but held together by a thin thread of determination. I hesitated, unsure whether I had the strength for another emotional blow, yet something in her expression told me she carried truth, not accusation. Once inside, she sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. She began sharing fragments of memories, quiet confessions about moments she had dismissed for years, dark impulses, manipulative tendencies, signs she now regretted ignoring. As she spoke, I felt an unsettling recognition settle in my chest. Her doubts echoed my own. Then came the twist I wasn't prepared for. She admitted she believed her daughter was capable of harming someone. The words hung between us like a storm cloud, and in that fragile silence, I realized she deserved to know the full truth. So I told her what really happened with the champagne glass. I watched the shock wash over her, followed by grief so deep it seemed to hollow the room. In that moment, the two of us sat bound by an unspoken understanding. We were not enemies. We were collateral in someone else's ambition. When she finally left, I knew what I had to do next. It was time to bring in a professional, someone who could uncover what lay beneath the surface before it was too late. I never imagined I would reach a point where hiring a private investigator felt like the only rational choice. Yet there I was, sitting at my kitchen table with a quiet resolve settling into my bones. It felt unnatural to turn that level of scrutiny onto my own family, but the truth had already begun to show itself in fragments, and I needed the full picture before the danger swallowed me whole. When the report arrived, I read it slowly, bracing myself for what I already sensed. The first blow was the financial spiral, reckless spending, hidden debts, and desperate attempts to stay afloat. I felt something inside me sag under the weight of it. Then came the deeper cut, a life insurance policy taken out in my name. Seeing that detail in print chilled me in a way the hospital never had. And finally, the strangest connection of all, repeated visits to a psychiatrist known for initiating competency challenges against elderly patients. Their path had been carved long before the champagne glass ever touched the table. As I absorbed the last page, the sorrow inside me hardened into something sharper. Not vengeance, but clarity. If they were preparing to corner me, then I needed to be 2 steps ahead. I began shaping a plan grounded in their own assumptions. I knew their greed well enough to predict how they would move if they believed I was growing weaker, more trusting, more vulnerable. So I crafted an invitation that looked like a softening, an olive branch extended from a weary mother. In truth, it was the opening door of a trap. And soon, they would walk through it, straight into the final reveal waiting in Section 10. They arrived with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing the world is tilting quietly in your favor. I watched them step inside, both of them carrying that thin veneer of concern that had begun to look more like entitlement every time I saw it. I let the silence sit between us, heavy and deliberate, because I knew the next knock would change everything. When it came, sharp and authoritative, I felt the air shift. The officers entered with calm purpose, and I could see Megan stiffen as if the room suddenly grew colder. Ethan's face flickered with confusion, then irritation, as though this interruption stood between him and whatever outcome he imagined he deserved. I stayed still, hands folded, heart steady. The officers began with the toxicology results, laying out the facts piece by piece. Hearing them confirm the presence of poison felt surreal, even though I had known it from the moment the glass left Megan's hand. I watched her carefully, saw the panic rising behind her practiced expressions. Ethan tried to mask his unease, but his eyes betrayed him. Then came the second revelation. The poisoned glass had been intended for me. Listening to that truth spoken aloud broke something inside me, even as it validated every instinct I had tried to ignore. And the third blow, the life insurance policy, landed with a finality that left the room hollow. Megan crumbled first, her facade dissolving into frantic denial. Ethan staggered emotionally, clinging to excuses that sounded thinner with every passing second. I felt sorrow unfurl through me, deep and aching, because I had once held that boy as the center of my world. His voice cracked into remorse, confusion, desperation. But I could see it clearly now. There was no path that led back to the life we had before, and as the officers moved closer, I understood we had crossed the point of no return, heading toward the quiet reckoning of Section 11. The house felt unbearably still after the officers left, as if the walls themselves were trying to absorb the shock I could no longer hold. I stood there in the quiet, letting the weight of what had unfolded settle into my bones. My son's face lingered in my mind, that mix of panic and pleading, and I felt the familiar ache of loving someone who had already stepped too far into the shadows. I knew I could grieve for the boy he once was without welcoming the man he had become back into my life. Megan's fate moved quickly after that night. From what I later learned, the evidence left little room for denial. I did not feel triumph in that knowledge, only a tired sorrow for the path she chose and the chaos she dragged into all our lives. Ethan's road was less defined. His involvement sat in a murky place between intent and cowardice, and the law handled him accordingly. But the emotional consequence, that was mine to carry, and I carried it quietly. What I did not expect was the small hand that wrapped around mine a few weeks later. My granddaughter looked up at me with a tenderness that cut through every layer of hurt. In her presence, I found something untouched by betrayal. She gave me purpose again, guiding me back into routines that felt safe and whole. The security systems remained, the documents stayed in place, yet the fear that once clung to me slowly loosened. I began to breathe differently, more fully, as if reclaiming a home that had briefly become unfamiliar. Survival had asked a great deal of me, more than I ever imagined at my age, but it also returned me to myself. And with that steadying truth, I felt the story shifting toward its final reflection in Section 12. In the quiet moments now, I find myself looking back on what happened with a kind of steady understanding I did not have before. I once believed love alone could hold a family together, but life has a way of teaching us that love without boundaries can leave us unprotected. I carry sadness for the choices my son made, yet I no longer let that sadness define my days. Survival asked me to draw lines I never imagined drawing, and in doing so, I rediscovered my own worth. There is peace in my home again. It is softer, slower, and more deliberate than the life I once lived, but it is mine. And when my granddaughter reaches for me, I feel the future opening in a way that feels gentle and honest. She reminds me that even after betrayal, there are still pieces of life worth tending to, still moments that glow quietly when we allow ourselves to heal. If my story offers anything, I hope it is this. You are allowed to protect yourself, even when it hurts. You are allowed to choose peace. If you have ever faced something similar, I invite you to share your thoughts or experiences in the comments.